逐浪，在海天之间，人脚下涛涌浪飞旋，为梦想启程，高扬起风帆，我们同船渡破浪向前，激流勇进在潮头之巅，开新天无曲间重现，新世界的旅途美丽又遥远，我们共开创风光无限。
An amazingly tragic catastrophe has happened to the Sun. The Sun has lost its magnetic polarity in the northern polar region. While the loss is not visibly apparent by looking at the Sun with standard telescopes, even during eclipse conditions, the fact is that the Sun's northern magnetic field has vanished as if it had never existed. For as long as scientists have tracked the magnetic polarity of the Sun, which became possible from the 1970s on with specialized equipment, the Sun has flipped its polar magnetic field to the opposite polarity consistently 5 years into each solar cycle. This has never failed until now. The Sun's polar magnetic field should have flipped in 2013 for solar cycle 24, but nothing happened in the northern region. The polarity flipped in the southern region in 2015, but in the north, the polarity from the previous cycle simply fizzed out to nothing. The north of the Sun became magnetically neutral thereby, and it remained that way. We should see a big blue patch starting in 2013 in the north, as in the cycle 22, but nothing of this sort happened. How weak has the solar system become for the polar magnetic reversal to fail? Obviously, this amazing event isn't caused by the Sun itself. As the Sun is understood in mainstream science, it cannot suddenly change so dramatically. The only logical explanation that remains, therefore, is that the Russian President Vladimir Putin had something to do with this, as we say in the West when anything bad happens in the world. Of course, we could also ask the Sun about what it can tell us regarding the incidents. It might shed some light on the case. All we need to do is decipher its language. We know that what happened is real. When a number of top scientists from 3 leading institutions with access to data from the most advanced technological instruments become so concerned that they issue a 19-page research paper on the subject, it should raise some eyebrows, and probably more than that. The theories that are presented in the research report are largely speculative for the lack of a clear understanding of the language of the Sun, in spite of the amazing technologies that we now have for looking at the Sun. The data that we now have should enable us to look deeper than we have in the past, to look under its skin, and to look beyond even that to the principles involved, as I am doing with this video. But is this really possible? Can we learn the language of the Sun? can we decipher what the sun is really telling us with all its numerous hints and paradoxes, from the gigantic to the minuscule. Maybe we ought to make a greater effort than ever before to look really under its skin and learn its language from the ground up, to glean its secrets that have so far puzzled us. Human civilization became developed on this platform into what it is today with the development of languages. Shouldn't this experience help us with the sun too, so that we may be able to discover the cosmic technologies that make it tick? Shouldn't an advanced deciphering of the language of the sun help us, at the very least, to step away from the far too many mythological concepts that we still harbor about the sun? This would be a critical step because, as we will discover thereby, we are presently locked into a war against our very existence by ignoring what the sun actually has to tell us about it. The development of culture and civilization goes hand in hand with the development of written languages and their power of expression to communicate ideas and discovered principles. Some languages had flourished, and the societies with them, and some have become lost over time so that we can no longer decode them. An example of a lost language is the language of the Harappan civilization that had flourished amazingly well in the Indus Valley for 2,000 years. Its language, though it became a written language, became lost when the civilization suddenly vanished 3,300 years ago. It appears that all great cultural advances in the history of civilization had an equally great written language standing behind them, such as the epic literary work attributed to Homer, which has set the stage for the dawn of the Greek classical culture and has shaped Western culture up to modern time. It may well be that without language development efforts by Dante Alighieri back in the 12th century, who brought together the best features of the Italian dialects into a comprehensive high-level language, that the golden renaissance of the 15th century might not have happened, and the great humanist developments that came out of it might not have occurred. It appears that even the cosmic universe has a specific language, as it were, through which it can be understood. It speaks the language of plasma that modern society is gradually beginning to decipher. Researchers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory have come to recognize that more than 99.999% of the mass of the universe exists in the form of plasma. They have come to recognize that plasma spans all space and is the lifeblood of the universe, hence its name. Plasma simply is everywhere. It is so small that it cannot be seen. but is so basic to everything that even the portion of the universe that isn't plasma is a construct of it. Plasma is a part of the universe in its most intimate, explicate form, as the leading theoretical physicist David Bohm sees the universe. He sees the apparently empty cosmic space in terms of a vast sea of latent energy, with ripples in its expression unfolding that become discrete, but not separate from it. Albert Einstein is quoted to have referred to David Bohm as his successor. Plasma exists as a mixture of two types of tiny electrically charged particles called protons and electrons that interact with the immensely powerful electric force that is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than gravity. The electrons are the smallest component of plasma. They are almost 2,000 times smaller than the protons. They are electrically attracted to it, but then are strongly repelled on contact by an even stronger nuclear force, only to be attracted again. Thus, the electrons are drawn into an endless dance around and between the protons. By the interaction of free-flowing plasma in cosmic space, plasma combines into moving streams. In some cases, plasma also combines into large coherent spheres that interact with the moving streams. Cosmic space is filled with examples of both. When plasma is in motion, it speaks the language of magnetism. The movement of electrically charged particles creates a magnetic force around the path of the motion. When electrons flow in two parallel wires in the same direction, the encircling magnetic fields combine and draw the wires towards each other. The effect is termed the Lorentz force, in honor of its discoverer. In space, the combining effect of the electric and magnetic fields draws large movements of plasma together into self-concentrating streams. These self-aligned streams can extend across large distances, spanning light years between stars, even millions of light years between galaxies, and clusters of galaxies, and so on. Also, as plasma streams flow, they attract plasma from surrounding space, whereby they increase in density. And as they gain ever greater density, the plasma streams become pinched together more strongly magnetically. Of course, as the cross-section of the stream becomes smaller by the pinch effect, the resulting greater compression density also increases the magnetic field concentration, which in turn increases the pinch effect. The self-escalating process of pinching the plasma into ever smaller volumes continues until the interacting system creates itself a crisis and breaks down. At this point, a different set of principles come into play, according to the unfolding situation. In order to discover what happens at a point of crisis, a set of high-energy discharge experiments were conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico in the USA under the direction of Antonin Parrott. The amazing plasma flow geometry that is illustrated here, shown in purple, resulted in the experiment. The entire plasma input stream was concentrated into an extremely narrow stream of great density. A compression ratio exceeding 1,000 to 1 resulted in the experiment, possibly as high as 5,000 to 1. The experiments further revealed that the narrow stream that resulted was itself but a ring-like construction of 56 discrete filaments of plasma of extremely high density. The compression ratio at this point might have exceeded the range of 1,000,000 to 1. An illustration of a ring of filaments of this type is found in cosmic space surrounding the center of the long-vanished supernova 1987A. The experiment illustrates that when the pinch effect becomes so great that the plasma stream loses its forward momentum, it begins to flow into itself, whereby a new magnetic geometry unfolds that curls some of the moving plasma backwards, and which also folds the highly concentrated magnetic fields backwards, by which the plasma becomes trapped under a dome-type structure, where it is super concentrated, as it has no place to go. Eventually, when the concentration becomes strong enough to overcome the confining force under the dome, a narrow stream of hyperconcentrated plasma flows explosively out of the confinement. The plasma flow researcher David Lapointe, who explored the dynamics statically, termed the magnetic confinement structure the confinement dome, and the magnetic fields that flip the plasma backwards the flip ring, and another magnetic field that keeps the plasma from escaping the choke ring, and the entire complex he termed the primer fields. Enormously large magnetic forces must have developed in the process of creating the filaments, and to keep the entire construct as tightly confined as the experiment illustrates. Plasma is not visible. It doesn't emit light, nor does it absorb it. Plasma becomes visible only by its effect, such as by moving plasma energizing atomic elements that thereby emit light and create sunlight. When large volumes of plasma form a sphere combined by gravity, the electrons of the plasma, which are in constant motion, being attracted to the protons, but repelled again at close distances, and them being 2,000 times lighter than the protons, tend to migrate to the surface away from the center of gravity. As this happens, the protons that are more isolated thereby repel each other more strongly. The end result is that a large sphere of plasma has its highest mass density and also its highest electron density on its surface, and has the least of them at its center. Such a sphere of plasma is a sun. It exists as a relatively light shell of plasma with little mass inside, but one that is teeming with a great density of electrons on its surface, forming a vast carpet of electric activity in the form of flowing streams of plasma. This electrically charged sphere presents to the space around it an immensely strong electric field, with which it attracts plasma and then reacts with it. It reacts with it so intensely that atomic elements are synthesized in the process. In this immensely energetic process, the synthesized atomic elements emit light. All atomic elements that exist are synthesized in this process and emit light according to their individual spectra. The light is the sunlight that we see. Every sun or star is a sphere of plasma. It reacts with interstellar plasma on its surface. Everything happens on its surface. Atomic elements are synthesized there, and light is emitted by the atomic elements on a wide band of energy emissions that extend far above and below the range of the visible light band. That this is so is easily visible. Just look at the sun with an appropriate telescope. The sunspots that you see are all dark at the umbra. The sun is dark inside. Nothing happens within it. It is largely empty. But on the surface, the sun has a granule structure that is a wide sea of plasma fusion cells. Here is where the cosmic plasma stream phenomena and the plasma sphere phenomena come together. The sun comes to light as a star that is located at a magnetic node point of an interstellar plasma stream, where the plasma in the stream becomes intensely concentrated. The plasma sun is located at the center between two large magnetic primal field structures, similar to those created in the laboratory experiment. In the experiment, a portion of the plasma energy was dissipated into an ecliptic ring. The dissipation enabled the plasma stream to expand again, which it does in the reverse of the process. It flows into a confinement dome, from which it expands again. Since the outflow is weaker, its confinement dome is correspondingly smaller. In the solar system, where the primal fields develop at a node point between two interstellar plasma streams, with the sun in the middle, the sun serves as the plasma-consuming element that makes the flow-through nature of the plasma structures possible. These flow-through type structures are not uncommon in space. They are typically seen in the form of large nebulae, where enough atomic material exists in the background to make the plasma streams visible. With the few basic concepts of the plasma language established, we can begin to decode what the sun is telling us about itself in the context of what we already know about it. We know, for example, that the sun rotates significantly faster at its equator than at its polar regions. The mechanistic sun as a gas sphere doesn't allow for this to happen. But the plasma sun tells us rather plainly that the differential rotation of the sun is so natural that one would be surprised if it wasn't happening. If the sun was a solid body of atomic elements or gases, like the big gas planets are, it would, like them, rotate essentially as a single unit. On Jupiter, the outer atmosphere rotates only a minuscule 5 minutes slower at the poles in its 10-hour rotation period. The difference adds up to 0.8%. On the Sun, however, we see a 40% difference in rotational speed. The equator of the Sun rotates 40% faster. This difference is huge, and more amazing than this is that the rotational speed varies only minutely across a wide band centered on the equator of the Sun between the 30 degrees north and south latitudes. Across this band, the rotational speed varies only 4%, while the bulk of the difference in rotational speed occurs in the higher latitudes. The large differential in the rotational speed of the Sun is not readily visible, nor is it of any great practical significance except to indicate that the rotation of the Sun is externally powered by the rotating magnetic fields of the plasma streams in which it is located. No other cause than an external cause can make sense for this phenomenon, nor is an internal cause actually possible. The answer why the differential rotation is driven from outside the Sun can be found in the high-energy discharge experiment that I had previously referred to, that had been conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory by Anthony Barrett. As I had noted earlier, the entire input stream became compressed in the experiment by the self-formed primer fields into a thin stream of plasma that incorporates a ring of 56 self-rotating plasma filaments. If one applies the observed principle to the solar system, and to the Sun being located within the high-density plasma stream, it becomes self-evident what powers the Sun's rotation. When one sees the Sun located within a cylinder of magnetically rotating plasma filaments, according to the principle of Birkeland currents, it becomes plain to recognize that the magnetic field that causes their rotation becomes inducted into the surface of the Sun. Being plasma, the Sun is electrically conductive. This means that by electromagnetic coupling, the rotation in the plasma stream is transmitted into the surface of the Sun that thereby rotates with the rotating magnetic field. Evidently, the resulting induction is the strongest where the space to the Sun is the closest. By this principle, the equator of the Sun rotates the fastest, and the polar regions the slowest, that are more weakly magnetically coupled. At the equator, a single rotation is completed in 25 days, and at the poles in 35 days. In the polar regions, the low induction appears to actively slow the surface rotation. Otherwise, the entire Sun would likely spin at the same rotational speed by internal coupling as the gas planets do. The differential rotation of the Sun is sometimes cited as the cause for the Sun's polar magnetic polarity reversal and for the differential orientation of its magnetic field, both of which are perplexing as a mechanistic phenomena. But when we speak the language of the real solar dynamics that are not mechanistic in nature, everything that we see expressed is governed by electrodynamics. Thus, speaking the correct language solves many of the perplexing puzzles. The language of the plasma dynamics even solves the paradox. Why, when we look at the corona around the Sun, the differential rotation between the various regions is not noticeable. The same applies to the Sun in visible light. There, the differential in solar activity is only evident in erupting sunspots, and those hadn't even been noticed until a few hundred years ago. Ironically, the sunspots remain largely a paradox to the present day. Nevertheless, the slight differential in the closeness of the surface of the Sun to the rotating filament of the plasma streams that powers the Sun in the entire band between the 30 degrees latitudes becomes visibly apparent in the central band of the Sun, being the Sun's active region, where most of the sunspots, loops and flares and so on happen. And even this becomes only apparent when we look behind the scene with modern space-based telescopes, such as the SOHO and SDO satellites, and begin to search for the drivers for what we see, because a lot of what we see there isn't really possible on the mechanistic platform. One of the impossible aspects that shouldn't happen is the Sun's symmetric magnetic field orientation related to its equator. What we see happening on the Sun is amazingly contrary to what we see on the Earth. On the Earth, the magnetic field that forms around it is only oriented in one single direction, between north and south. It is believed that a dynamo effect creates a central dipole field on Earth that has the magnetic field lines flowing from pole to pole, so that the magnetic field lines all flow in the same direction. Consequently, the compass points to the magnetic North Pole on the Earth, no matter where one may be located. The Sun doesn't operate that way. The Sun has its magnetic field imposed on it, and in a peculiar manner. On the Sun, we encounter two sets of magnetic fields that are oriented in opposite directions, symmetric to the equator. The color-coded magnetograph that is shown here presents the changing magnetic field orientation as it had been detected on the surface of the Sun over the span of a solar cycle. The symmetry of the pattern divides the Sun into two symmetrically opposite hemispheres. What we see indicated here wouldn't be possible on the Earth, and shouldn't be possible on the mechanistic Sun either. But it is totally real. The Sun speaks a different language, as it were. The dividing feature that separates the Sun into two magnetically opposite hemispheres is only possible in the plasma language. This feature reveals to be the existence of external symmetric magnetic fields that are separated by the heliospheric current sheet that is precisely aligned with the equator of the Sun. The heliospheric current sheet is a thin sheet of plasma that is as perfectly aligned with the equator of the Sun as are the rings of Saturn to Saturn's equator. Both structures form a thin disk, as thin and flat as the galaxy is in principle. Evidently, the ring structures, the galactic structure, and the structure of the heliospheric current sheet all share a common principle. The rings of Saturn are, of course, the planets ecliptic. The moons of Saturn orbit closely aligned to this ecliptic, just as the planets of the solar system are aligned to the solar ecliptic. The rings around Saturn are about 10 kilometers thick and extend outward as a perfect plane to roughly 80,000 kilometers. In comparison, the heliospheric current sheet is a whopping 10,000 kilometers. Is a whopping 10,000 kilometers thick near the Earth and extends potentially across 15 billion kilometers of space, where it connects up with the distant heliosphere of plasma that surrounds the solar system. The perfect alignment of the heliospheric current sheet with the ecliptic is not by chance, but is evidently driven by the electric force repulsion, which is the repulsion of electric elements of equal electric polarity, with the surface of the Sun being electron-intense around the entire sphere. Whatever plasma flows outward from the Sun is repelled from both sides equally, as both hemispheres are identical in electric potential. The current sheet is aligned thereby and is actively propelled outward. As I also had said, the heliospheric current sheet is aligned with the equator of the Sun and extends out from it along the plane of the ecliptic, all the way to the heliosphere. This giant plasma sheet appears to serve as a guide for magnetic fields, a type of insulator that keeps the magnetic fields separated, that evidently extend from each of the primal fields, each with an opposite magnetic polarity. This has an amazing effect on the Sun. The effect is so powerful that the magnetic field lines in the Sun's hemispheres are able to orient the flow of the plasma loops, which flow from sunspots into different directions in each hemisphere, according to the orientation of its field lines. Sunspots are damaged areas on the surface of the Sun that result from erupting plasma currents. If the currents are weak, the surface magnetic field bends the plasma stream backwards to the surface of the Sun, according to the direction in which the field lines are oriented. The eruption of sunspots thereby creates loops with a specific directionality, depending on in which direction the magnetic field bends the loops. The plasma eruptions that occur on the Sun when they are bent backwards into the Sun typically result in pairs of closely spaced sunspots that are horizontally aligned. This means that the eruption flow and the re-entry flow create a pair of magnetized areas on the surface of the Sun nearby the sunspots, but with opposite magnetic polarity. The relative position of the opposite polarities to each other indicates in which direction the magnetic field has bent the loop. For an example, let's look at sunspot 2700 as seen on February 27, 2018. When seen with a telescope, we see it as just a tiny spot on the surface of the Sun. It is so tiny that it is almost lost in the sea of brilliance. But when one looks at the same area with a satellite magnetic imager camera, one sees two opposite polarized regions appearing side by side, coded green and yellow in this example. When one looks at the same spot in the high UV light band, one can actually see the plasma loops happening that cast the spots. The orientation of the loops is typically perpendicular to the orientation of the magnetic field lines that bend the plasma flow. The images shown here were created by NASA's SDO satellite. Now let's look at another example from an earlier time, from May 24, 2015. The image on the left shows 4 sunspot groups in the visible light, and the image on the right shows the magnetic imaging of the same areas. Note that in the upper hemisphere, the black-colored polarity appears to the right of the white, while in the lower hemisphere, the black appears to the left of the white. This tells us that the magnetic field lines in the different hemispheres were oriented in opposite directions. The differently oriented polarization proves also graphically that the Sun's northern and southern hemispheres are magnetically symmetric rather than homogeneous as they are on the Earth. This polarity differential is a significant proof that the Sun's magnetic field is imposed onto it from the outside by the magnetic action of the different primofields. It also proves something else. It proves that not all loop structures on the Sun are strong enough to create sunspots. The uppermost magnetic spot doesn't have a sunspot associated with it. This proves that sunspots are extreme events, and that lesser loop structures can exist that don't produce sunspots. In this UV image on the right, the plasma loops associated with the magnetic spots are faintly visible. And in the more expanded view here, it becomes clearly recognizable that the plasma loops all occur essentially horizontally aligned as one would expect them to be when being forced by a magnetic field extending from the equator. This effect is also seen in the upper loop that didn't cause a sunspot. Now let's look at another set of sunspots from the previous solar cycle, this time from March in the year 2000. We see a string of sunspots extremely close to the equator, and a tiny one on top in the middle, and another one on the right. Since the sun's magnetic polarity flips with every solar cycle, we see the polarity differential reversed. In the previous image, we saw the white shadow on the left in the upper hemisphere. Now we see the white shadow on the right. This means that the shadow is now cast by the opposite magnetic orientation. This same reversal is also evident in the lower hemisphere, as it should be, because the solar magnetic polarity reversal flips the field lines in both hemispheres simultaneously into their opposite direction. The symmetric magnetic field reversal proves that the primal fields, which impose their polarity, are very real and are deeply connected with the most intimate functions of the sun. It has long been recognized that the sun reverses all of its magnetic fields to their opposite polarization in an 11-year solar cycle, and then back again in the next cycle for a full cycle time of 22 years. The magnetographic illustration shown here indicates how the various regions of the sun had been magnetically polarized over the span of the last 45 years. But how is the polarization reversal generated? What controls it? What controls the timing? The answer is amazing. For this we need to go back to the high-energy discharge experiment by Anthony Barrett at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The plasma structure that forms in the high-energy experiment created a large confinement dome. The plasma pressure that builds up under the dome appears to be directed downward and increases the plasma outflow onto the sun. The differential creates a corresponding magnetic field polarity. However, when the pressure builds up in the confinement dome so much in intensity that it exceeds the strength of the confinement field, the dome ruptures at the top at its weakest point. When this happens, some of the build-up pressure in the dome vents into space, in the opposite direction of flow. The change in balance, together with the magnetic disconnection at the top of the dome, generates a strong magnetic field with opposite polarity. The opposite polarity thereby becomes the dominant polarity from this point on. The polarity is maintained for as long as the outflow from the dome continues, or is forced back to change by external causes. Inversely, when the pressure in the dome drops and the containment is re-established or is re-established by external causes, the original magnetic polarity becomes re-established too and becomes dominant again. The magnetic field then flips back again to its former orientation. By this dynamic principle, a plasma stream flowing in the same direction can create an oscillation of alternately oriented magnetic fields. This type of principle is evidently the cause for the cyclical polarity reversal that we see evident on the Sun. However, the polarity reversal isn't quite as simple as that. The magnetographic illustration that shows the changing polarity in the regions of the Sun from pole to pole over the span of a solar cycle shows that the magnetic reversal in the polar regions of the Sun occurs late in the solar cycle, almost 5 years late. This delay creates a puzzle in the mechanistic cosmology. It shouldn't be happening at all. The delay is theorized to be caused by magnetic material slowly drifting from the active regions to the poles. Can this be so? In plasma language, the delay is recognized as the result of the natural differential of the magnetic field propagation caused by the different media. In empty space, magnetic fields propagate at the speed of light. In dense plasma streams, the propagation speed is determined by the density of the plasma, which is typically the plasma's pressure propagation speed. If one considers that the primal fields are potentially located halfway within the heliosphere, the Sun's distance to the primal fields would be roughly 7 billion kilometers. The 5-year delay over this distance would add up to a propagation speed of 45 kilometers per second, which is well within the range of what is reasonably possible. This means that the polarity reversal delay is not an enigma in plasma language. For the rest of the Sun, the polarity reversal is not delayed, as the magnetic field lines that flow outside the plasma streams propagate near the speed of light. The fast fields evidently don't reach all the way to the poles, though. The poles would be dominated by the high-density plasma flow. The slow plasma flow in the high-density plasma streams, in comparison with the magnetic propagation speed that affects the central region of the Sun, is also responsible for the shape of the sunspot cycles as we see them evident increasingly. The reason why the solar activity peaks at the middle of the solar cycle is that it takes 5 years for a plasma pressure wave from the primal fields that is generated as a type of shock wave with the polar reversal to reach to the Sun. The delay is due to the long transition time, crossing 7 billion kilometers of space from the primal fields to the Sun. The plasma pressure around the Sun is critical. It is a variable factor for solar activity. When the plasma density is high, two things happen. The solar activity becomes intense and large numbers of sunspots are created. High plasma density on the Sun also blocks to a larger degree the cosmic ray emissions from the Sun. This effect makes the peak of the solar cycle, with the densest plasma sphere around the Sun, the weakest in solar cosmic ray flux. Inversely, it makes the valley between the solar cycles, which is weak in plasma pressure around the Sun, the period of the strongest solar ray flux reaching the Earth, and also the period of the largest coronal holes. The 11-year solar cycle itself begins with a shock event in the confinement domes. The process of breaching or closing a confinement dome's magnetic structure changes the polarity of the magnetic field orientation that is projected from the primal fields onto the Sun. The shock in the dome thereby starts the magnetic field reversal, which becomes evident immediately on the surface of the Sun. In addition, the shock event in the dome also sets off a plasma pressure wave from the input dome. The wave builds up pressure around the Sun, which gains its maximum in typically 5 years, and diminishes thereafter as the build-up wave flows past the Sun. The pressure build-up and diminishment is reflected in the sunspot numbers. The numbers gain their maximum at maximum plasma pressure. The shock event in the magnetic confinement dome, of course, also emits a magnetic wave along the axis of the plasma stream. The magnetic field propagation is a slow process in a high-density plasma stream, but it too reaches the Sun in about 5 years, projected from the input side. As a tidally confined stream, the projected magnetic polarity affects only the polar region of the Sun above the 60-degree latitude. When it becomes active, it flips the polar magnetic field orientation in the northern hemisphere. The magnetic polarity from the outflow side takes a little longer to arrive at the Sun as it flows through less dense plasma. The lower density that results from the Sun having consumed a portion of the plasma stream. The lower density thereby increases the propagation time. Thus, the magnetic wave that flows from the outflow side affects the polar region of the southern hemisphere of the Sun, somewhat delayed, typically delayed by 2 years. By this differential origin, the polar magnetic field reversal is not happening at the same time in both hemispheres. The time difference can be as much as a single year or 2 years or longer, reflecting differences in propagation time. But ultimately, the timing of the polar reversal are of not great importance. The timing that separates the solar cycles from each other is not determined by the polar magnetic reversal, but is determined by the shock event that starts the magnetic reversal at the home base in the confinement domes. Several types of oscillations have the potential to cause the big solar cycle oscillations to happen. the oscillation can be potentially caused by the plasma pressure wave arriving at a dome on the outflow side. The wave arrives there after its 11 years propagation, crossing 15 billion kilometers of space, flowing in a tightly confined plasma stream. With both of the primal fields being magnetically connected with each other across empty space, the pair of primal fields have the potential to be magnetically synchronized within a couple of hours. In cosmic terms, that's instantaneous. The 11-year solar cycle may also be the result of a two-way magnetic oscillation cycles, each flowing within the high-density plasma streams to the opposite primal fields. Each of the magnetic field projections would take the same path and reach the other's magnetic dome at the same time. This could cause a magnetic reversal to happen without external synchronization. It could also be that both the magnetic wave and the plasma wave acting together may cause the polarity reversal in the domes that starts the next solar cycle. It is worth noting at this point that as the solar system as a whole has been diminishing, as it apparently has from the late 1990s onward, as the result of the general weakening, the polar magnetic field strength of the Sun has diminished accordingly. The same weakening is also expressed in slower propagation times throughout the system. This has lengthened the interval between the polarity reversals that start the next solar cycle. The lengthened interval has lengthened the solar cycle as a whole. Something big is in progress here that has sparked significant concerns. The magnetographic that is presented here is a composite result of a major study that I had mentioned at the beginning. The graphic is contained within a 19-page research report titled The Reversal of the Sun's Magnetic Field in Cycle 24. It is presented by contributors from 3 major institutions and data from leading-edge facilities. The potential increase of the duration of the solar cycle 24 is not trivial. For cycle 23, the increase in duration was 23%. Cycle 24 promises to increase even that. The weakening of the plasma streams in the solar system is also expressed in lower sunspot numbers. For cycle 23, the sunspot numbers were 15% lower than the previous one. It is interesting to note, too, that the solar cycle 23 covered the entire time frame in which the Ulysses spacecraft had measured the solar wind pressure and saw it diminishing by 30% between the start and end of the cycle. Also note that in comparison with cycle 24, cycle 23 was still a strong cycle. The weakening of the plasma streams in the solar system is even expressed in the Sun's polar magnetic field strengths. Note that in comparison with cycle 22, The polar magnetic field reversal in cycle 23 was significantly weaker, and that for cycle 24, the northern reversal is missing altogether. Solar cycle 24 began in 2008. The traditional polar reversal should have happened in 2013, 5 years into the cycle. But it didn't happen. Some form of reversal appears to have happened in the southern polar region in 2015, 7 years into the solar cycle and 2 years late. But in the northern polar regions of the Sun, no sign has been seen of anything decisive happening up to 2016, which is the limit of the data available. The missing northern polar polarity is also shockingly evident in the Hathaway solar magnetic graphic that covers a slightly longer time frame. The northern solar polarity change that should have happened in 2013 isn't just late this time, it didn't materialize at all. It just didn't happen. The missing polarity seems to indicate that the plasma inflow into the primal field system was too weak for anything significant to happen. The reason why the southern polarity startup did happen may be due to the southern magnetic polarity being reflected. It reflects back the effect of the magnetic reversal carried by the old plasma density from the previous solar cycle, which apparently was stronger than the new density flowing into the system, which has become so weak that it no longer makes the grade at all. The northern solar polarity that we saw in cycle 23 may have been the last one for 90,000 years to come till the next interglacial period recovers the now fading solar system. It seems that we have crossed the bridge to a no return already in this respect. The polar magnetic polarity may end altogether in cycle 25 and not materialize again for the next 90,000 years, potentially together with the sunspots. This seems to tell us that the solar system is in the first phases of crashing. This should raise some eyebrows, because the next system reset isn't scheduled to be happening until the year 92,020. That's a long way away. The modern technology that we now have enables us to measure events that we couldn't have seen prior to the 1970s. Fortunately, the early measurements that we now have available, especially those for the cycles 21 and 22, gave us a yardstick with which to measure the dramatic weakening that has begun with cycle 23 and has increased in cycle 24 and is continuing to increase. The entire solar system is presently in a state of transition. The dynamics are getting weaker, and the propagation times are getting longer. The weakening of the dynamics that we have witnessed in the technological measurements are far from being trivial. The changes that we saw appear even more momentous when one considers that the primal fields that are critical for solar dynamics are themselves magnetic constructs that are formed by the movements of flowing plasma. They are formed by it. Their geometry is shaped by it. They depend on a minimal volume of plasma flowing. And that's precisely what our measurements tell us is now diminishing, and is diminishing rapidly. We don't know, unfortunately, where on the diminishing slope the threshold is crossed, where the entire interconnected dynamic structure falls apart and vanishes as if it had never existed. But we do know that when this happens, the dynamics that focus plasma onto the sun no longer happen. The time frame of the high-powered sun then ends. The sun's activity level will then drop off to a much lower level, default state, a kind of hibernation state, where the sun's surface temperature will be measured at potentially the 4,000 degrees level, instead of the present 5,800 degrees Kelvin. The resulting 70% colder sun will usher in the next ice age that renders the Earth largely uninhabitable, partly because of the cold and partly because of the resulting 80% reduction of precipitation because of the cold. Humanity cannot continue to exist under such conditions. All regions outside the tropics become icebound with no hope for agriculture to continue. And in the regions that remain ice-free, the lands become deserts for the lack of rainfall. Both effects combined assure a near-total loss of agriculture across the world. That's what's at stake for the near future, potentially in the 2050s. That's what we are rushing into without anyone knowing it, and with the scientific community closing its eyes to it. Nevertheless, the consequences will be experienced with near absolute certainty. The Ice Age will happen. The process has already begun. It has been in progress for some time already. The slowing solar heartbeat, the diminishing sunspot numbers, and the weakening and missing solar polarity reversals are merely the latest addition to the now increasing rush towards the next ice age. I have pointed out in various previous videos that the interglacial climate began to cool shortly after its maximum and that the cooling is now accelerating. Then, 3,000 years ago, the big warming spikes began to diminish and the intervals between them became shorter. Similarly, 1,000 years ago, the solar minimum events became colder, and the intervals between them, likewise, became shorter in duration. While we were rescued in the 1700s from collapsing back into the full ice age, the rescue pulse that saved us is now spent. The solar system is rushing back to the conditions that we just barely escaped from and are dropping towards still lower levels. The diminishing solar wind pressure that began in the late 1990s, that the Ulysses satellites saw the beginning of, as a 30% reduction of the solar wind pressure in the time of a single solar cycle, cycle 23, is just another step of the ever-increasing rush to the next ice age that we find ourselves in. These events are real. They are not projections of something that may happen. They have already happened. They are a part of the history of the Sun. Neither are these solar events isolated events. They are waymarks on a path that we cannot get away from, that is becoming ever more precarious. In this context, the now missing polar magnetic reversal of the northern regions of the Sun is just another shoe dropping off along the path. As I pointed out in the previous video, the Ice Age is near, even statistically. It is scientifically understood and also scientifically hidden. Science should be the voice of truth. It may be that again someday. What we call the Ice Age is a long-term solar cycle that has been extensively researched, is extensively understood, and has been extensively buried. The tragedy needs to be reversed before it becomes an even bigger tragedy for all humanity. The Ice Age has put us on the train to oblivion that we cannot avoid. We can only aim to sidestep the consequences of the coming Ice Age by building us the technological infrastructures to do so. But we cannot stop the train from rolling. Nothing can stop the Ice Age dynamics, but we can act to get ready for them. While we have the capability and the resources to build us a new world in the tropics with modern types of technological infrastructures that the Ice Age cannot touch, nothing on this line is even considered, much less being built. For meeting the Ice Age challenge, we need to build 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each in the tropics, preferably along the equator, with new agriculture attached to them, enough to nourish 7 billion people. And since suitable land is scarce in the tropics, the new infrastructures will need to be placed afloat across the equatorial sea. Do I hear any protests here with screams that it is impossible to do? Of course it is impossible to do in the present landscape of zero-sum economics. Zero-sum equals impotence. The oligarchic master who aim to rule the world say to society, when we rob you to the bone, the total wealth in the world hasn't changed by the process. The losers are balanced by the winners. When the differences are added up, in the end, the sum is zero, isn't it? Except the game is a deception by intention to hide the crime. As the oligarchic masters steal liberally from society according to the platform of liberalism, they diminish the creative and productive capacity of society, and as a consequence, the world becomes poorer and poorer, till in the extreme there is no productive power left in the world, and the people perish. The stolen wealth, of course, becomes meaningless thereby in a world with a dead economy. When one adds up this advanced world, the sum total does indeed add up to zero. It is not possible to build anything on this zero-sum platform, much less a new world with high-end technological infrastructures. So what is the answer? How can we build a new world and live richly? The answer lies in the opposite of the dead-end game. The answer lies in building one another up to increase the creative and productive power of society to the utmost. This means that the new cities will be built rent-free as an investment by society into itself. No more rent slavery. Here the goal is no longer a sum of zero in the end, as in the zero-sum game. The goal is to increase the productive capacity of society 100,000-fold. That's the natural creative gain that is realized routinely in the universe. Whenever an atom is synthesized, the resulting structure is 100,000 times larger than the sum of its parts. That's the natural dimension of creativity. On this platform, anything can be built. The more is being built, the richer the world becomes. Then the foremost question will no longer be, where will the money come from? The question will then be, what else can we build to enrich our world and our civilization within it? The money for it will be created, if money should still play a role by then. A long time ago, in the late 1800s, the world-renowned American spiritual leader named Mary Baker Eddy had created a textbook to convey her discoveries. She had produced it with a glossary attached. In that glossary, she defined the term God. She defined it with a long list of synonymous spiritual concepts that characterized an idea of God. Surprisingly, the term good is not in the list. But isn't God good? Isn't the standard concept of Christianity that God is good? How did she solve the paradox that she created of the missing good in her definition for God? She solved the paradox in a profound manner. She defined the term good separately. She defined the term good as God. She says good is God. Good, thereby, is universal and limitless. She says in essence that if good isn't universal, there is something fundamentally lacking. On the platform of universal good, the needed 6,000 new cities can be built and will be built because it's fun and exciting to live and work as human beings. Universal good is the heart of our humanity. Of course, we are not at the decisive breakout point yet, reaching for the platform of universal good. China has taken some courageous steps towards universal good with the Belt and Road Initiative. We in the West, in comparison, presently lack the love for our own humanity to move in this direction likewise. In American history, the principle used to be called the general welfare principle. The principle is no longer honored. We may claim it back someday, as China has already done. But these, even the best of them, are but baby steps. We need to move in leaps and bounds ahead to match the universe and its 100,000-fold gain in creativeness. when our love for one another will enable us to do so, then we will have a future, and we will have a vastly richer society and more prosperous world than we presently have. But at the present stage, the zero-sum stage, we cannot reach for this future, for the lack of the love that would inspire us to acknowledge us as human beings and as sons of the universe. Someday we will see this happening. We will see us rise out of the easy chair and put the spade into the ground, so to speak. Then we will have a chance. To illustrate that the lack of love for our humanity is still extensive is evident by the fact that we still harbor thousands of nuclear bombs that we have built against each other and keep on hand with which to eradicate our existence, which we continuously improve in terms of their destructive capability, instead of us scrapping them all. But it only takes a change in perspective to start a complete turnaround. In the current arena of tenacious insanity, the Ice Age challenge may be our only hope, as it might inspire a new focus of concern and love for our humanity that would raise us out of the nuclear weapons trap and related issues with near absolute certainty. We have lived in the nuclear weapons trap for 70 years, with all efforts having failed so far for getting us out of the trap. Evidently, our efforts have been too small and our attempts too trivial. While the Ice Age phase shift is still roughly 30 years distant, its challenge is momentous and cannot be avoided, whereby it has the potential to change us and our outlook in the present from its confrontational mode towards the principle of the universal good, meeting the common aims of humanity. If we raise ourselves up to this universal level as human beings, the challenge can be honestly and easily addressed. But why should we fail on this front? The prospects that we find there are tremendous. Building a new world across the sea with new cities and new agriculture for almost 7 billion people, opening the door to greater prosperity and happiness than we have today, is imminently achievable. So why should anyone opt for death by starvation, by doing nothing to prevent it, if a richer world than any yet imagined lays within our grasp? Let's reach for it and live.